Okay. Good morning. I apologize for the delay. We decided that we should allow some time for people who are still filtering in. So we will get started now. I want to welcome you, and it's great to have you here. We're delighted to see all of you. To go back a few years, September 11th, 2001, one of those days that, if you are cognizant, you remember where you were and what you were doing when the incident took place. Now, it's kind of hard for me to realize, actually, that with a number of students, it's probably half your lives ago. But even then, I think you might have a recollection of that day and that time and what you were doing. It's sort of like, well, my generation especially remembers the assassination of John F. Kennedy in that same kind of a way. My parents' generation remembered the bombing of Pearl Harbor in that same kind of day. One of those sort of history-making days. In the wake of those planes flying into the Twin Towers in New York, the whole nation seemed to pull together, seemed to forget its differences for a time, and to be conscious of being one unified nation in the face of a common tragedy and having to deal with that. I don't know if you could hear the words or tried to listen even to the song that was playing when you came in, but it sort of says, well, on September 10th, we were black, we were white, we were all these different things, city, country, and so on. But on September the 11th, we were all just Americans. That song was played all over the place. It came out shortly after September 11th. And you heard it everywhere, radio, television. There were also a number of public service announcements on television with people of every age, men, women, girls, boys, every ethnicity you could think of, saying, I'm an American, I'm an American, I'm an American. That's how we all identify, or so it seemed. But were we really all that unified? Or was there, from the very beginning, a sense of demonizing certain people? At the time, we had a very outstanding young man here in the law school. I believe it was his first year, in fact. And he had played a major role in a number of Model UN activities in his time. And he was scheduled to go up to New York City shortly after 9/11 to participate, to help be in charge of a major program up there. And when he went to buy a train ticket to get to New York, Amtrak wouldn't issue him one. His first name happened to be Mohammed. He was obviously Muslim. And it required the intervention of the university president to get a train ticket for him to travel to New York. So from the very beginning, the words in that song didn't extend to everyone. In many people's minds, anyway, Muslim Americans might feel that they were also just Americans, but not all Americans felt that way about them. And the tragic truth was that the suspicion that greeted young Muhammad when he wanted the train ticket ultimately crystallized into the ugly specter of discrimination, as we know. A friend of mine who is here today, in fact, and knowing about this symposium, she sent me a few days ago an article about the no-fly list. And you might have heard that a number of people who are Muslim or even from countries or whose ancestry came from countries of largely Muslim populations have been put on the no-fly list, or in some of the most egregious circumstances, They've been allowed to go to their destination, but when they want to come home, all of a sudden they're not permitted to get back on the plane. Some of these people were actually born in the United States. They are United States citizens, or at least they have green cards or they're legal residents here. And yet they can't get back on the plane, and they don't know why not, and they're totally innocent. So we are living with some very ugly truths these days. Today, the Journal of Civil Rights and Social Justice and the Francis Lewis Law Center here at Washington and Lee seeks to unravel some of the complexities of the problems behind this phenomenon, in the hopes that maybe better understanding can help to spell at least some of the darkness that has haunted our Muslim fellow Americans for the past 12 years. This symposium will be published in the fall issue of the journal, and we have with us a stellar set of speakers for all of us to listen and to learn. Before we begin, I do want to emphasize that although I am the faculty advisor to the journal, the planning and the execution, all of the arrangements for this event were done totally by the students. They didn't even tell me the topic until not all that long ago. And they assembled this wonderful group that we have talking to us today. And they carried through with the letters, the invitations, the arrangements for the dinner we had last night for the speakers. And the person in charge was Monica Tolchinsky. Where is Monica? Oh, there she is. And it was really largely her hard work and other members of the journal working with her, and also the very able assistance of Wendy Rice, who is the assistant for the Francis Lewis Law Center, and she helps to make sure all of these things go smoothly. So I'd like you to help me welcome Monica, who will launch our program for today.
Thank you, Professor Massey, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Journal of Civil Rights and Social Justice 2013 Symposium, Discrimination Against Muslim Americans in a Post-9/11 World. I'm, as Massey has already introduced me, Monica Tolchinsky, the Symposium editor of the journal. You're going to have to bear with me a little bit today. I'm still getting over a case of bronchitis, as you might be able to hear. I speak for the entire journal board when I say we're all very excited about this year's topic, and as I'm sure all of you are. And we're even more excited to have such an impressive lineup of panelists for you today. A quick housekeeping issue. You may have noted on the website, Mr. Abed Ayub was slated to speak on this panel this morning with the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. Unfortunately, due to a personal emergency, he wasn't able to make it today. Our panelists today include distinguished representatives from major public interest organizations and law firms, as well as from prominent Muslim civil liberties advocacy organizations. And of course, we have our distinguished keynote speaker today, Nancy Hollander, who is one of the most prominent criminal defense attorneys, not only in the US, but in the world. All of our participants today will be speaking about a topic that all of us on the journal consider to be both politically salient as well as relevant to our journal's mission. The mission of our journal is to explore the intersection of majority and minority culture through discrete legal issues. We will be pursuing that mission today by first exploring the otherization in American culture of a particular minority group, American Muslims, and then treating a related discrete legal issue, that is the phenomenon of anti-Sharia legislation, which are laws in American states that seek to outlaw Islamic law in the American judicial system. So thank you all so much for being with us here today to discuss this important topic. Before we begin, there are several people I would like to thank. First, I would like to thank all of our esteemed panelists and our keynote for agreeing to share their expertise with us today, as well as our moderators for generously donating their time. I would like to thank Christina Becker, Kellen Lavin, and Ross Johnson, who are over here. who worked tirelessly with me to put this symposium together, and without whom it wouldn't have been possible. I'd like to thank the Francis Lewis Law Center and its director, A. Benjamin Spencer, for the generous support provided to the symposium, and as Professor Massey mentioned, Wendy Rice, the Law Center Administrative Assistant, for her always cheerful help and patience with me over the past few weeks. And lastly, I would like to thank all of our journal staff, many of whom are in the audience, for putting up with all of my emails over the past few weeks and happily performing all the tasks that were instrumental in putting this symposium together. I'd now like to introduce our first panel, Muslims in America Today, Where We Are, Where We've Been, and Where We're Going. The moderator for our first panel is Professor Timothy Kiefer. Professor Kiefer teaches national security law here at WNL, a course I can personally attest is worthwhile for the first year and second year law students in the audience to take. He was formerly the Chief Counsel and Deputy Officer for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. It's a mouthful. And we're very grateful to have him as our moderator today. So now, without further ado, I give the floor to Mr. Timothy Kiefer.
Thank you, Monica. And I want to thank you for being here this morning. I believe this is an extremely important topic in a post-9/11 environment, which is what we talk about a lot, especially in the U.S. government. And I also, of course, want to thank the panelists for all giving their time, and finally the Journal for Civil Rights and Social Justice for putting this on. I just want to make a brief comment. Monica mentioned my time at the Department of Homeland Security. I joined the Department of Homeland Security in 2003, its first year in existence, in the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. And among the many responsibilities we had there, two of which were the most important. The first one was receiving and investigating complaints of discrimination from the public at large, but in particular from individuals, particularly of that felt they were being either racially discriminated against or profiled based on their religion. And we worked, and in full disclosure, we worked often closely with organizations such as the Council on American Islamic Relations and the Muslim Public Affairs Council, along with the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. These organizations were extremely important in bringing to attention issues of concern, some of which included things like the no-fly list, which we had to work closely with TSA and the Terrorist Screening Center to try to improve. And that included also security screening, issues surrounding immigration. And these were critical for us to understand what was going on as the department was formed and began to be implemented throughout this country. So that was one aspect of it, but another aspect which we felt was just as equally important was outreach on behalf of the United States government to communities that were particularly affected in the post-9/11 environment. Those were the Arab, Muslim, Sikh, South Asian communities, to not only understand what they were facing, what individuals were facing on perhaps a daily basis, but also to find ways of improving governmental action and policies. And I'm confident in saying that we didn't always agree, and that there were disagreements. But the important part was that we were engaged in dialogue and receiving that input. So I think the fact that what I'm surprised at is that these many years later, after 9/11, that this in America is still an issue, right? That by this time, my expectation was we would no longer be talking about these issues, about discrimination or selective treatment and those types of things. So I think that says something right there, that this is even being held today. So that's what I wanted to say, and at this time I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Daniel Cox. He is the Director of Research and the co-founder of the Public Religion Research Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and education organization focusing on religion values in public life. Prior to joining PRRI, he served as research associate at the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, where he worked on the groundbreaking Religion Landscape Survey, one of the largest public opinion surveys on religion ever conducted. Dan specializes in youth politics and religion, and his work has appeared in numerous national news and religious publications, including the New York Times, ABC News, CNN, Newsweek, World Magazine, and others. Dan holds an MA in American Government from Georgetown University and a BA in Political Science from Union College. He is an active member of the American Association of Public Opinion Research. And I'd like you all to welcome Dan.
Thank you. So we're going to try to synchronize this. This is not an ideal configuration, but all right. So first, I just want to thank the Civil Rights and Social Justice Review for the opportunity to talk about this important topic today. PRI has been around since 2009, and during that time, we've conducted surveys on a wide range of topics, from God's role in sports to affirmative action, Jewish politics, immigration, abortion, reproductive issues, and economic inequality. Earlier this week, actually, I was having to explain to a reporter why mainline Protestants were less likely to have sex than other religious groups. So we conduct surveys on a wide range of topics, and a lot of them are really interesting. But I think there's few that are as consequential and understudied as the topic we're talking about today, which is attitudes about Muslims and Islam. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be able to talk about this issue and share some of our research. Before jumping into the main findings, though, I want to talk a little bit about sort of the principles that underlie religious tolerance and religious pluralism, and take a look at where the public is on these issues. So nearly 9 in 10 Americans say that America is founded on the idea of religious freedom for everyone, including religious groups that are popular. Near unanimity believe that all religious books should be treated with respect, even if we don't believe the religious beliefs of those who use them. And 2/3 of Americans believe in the separation of church and state. So, broadly speaking, Americans really embrace the principles of religious pluralism and tolerance. But when we see them in practice, we find that they're not evenly followed. And one of the reasons this is increasingly important is that the American religious landscape is changing rather dramatically. And this is happening for basically 3 reasons. First is we're seeing a de-Europeanization of American Christianity, with immigrants post-1965, when the immigration laws were loosened, coming over and really changing the face of American Christian institutions. So we had immigrants coming from Latin America and Asia, in particular Latin America, transforming institutions like the Catholic Church, which if you go to the Southwest now, the majority of Catholics in the Southwest are now Hispanic. We're also seeing a rise of the religious unaffiliated, which are really dramatically changing the landscape. In the early 1990s, roughly 6 or 7% of Americans identified as religiously unaffiliated. Today, that number stands about 1 in 5 Americans identifying that way. And lastly, and most relevant to our topic today, is we're also seeing increased immigration from immigrants from non-Western countries, so bringing different religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam, which is really sort of changing and challenging how we think about American identity. So much of the research in social science tells us that social interaction is really the key to understanding views of social and political outgroups. This is commonly known as contact hypothesis, and the idea being that the more you interact with someone from one of these groups, the better you feel disposed towards that group in general. In 2010, Putnam and Campbell actually gave this a little more memorable name when they call it the Aunt Susan effect. And essentially what it is everyone in their life has an Aunt Susan, right? Someone who they esteem highly, have a really good relationship with, who over the course of getting to know them, find out they're an atheist, a Muslim, a Buddhist. And then through that process, their views of that group actually becomes much warmer through the process of reevaluation. And this is a very powerful process, but it's not really happening for views among American Muslims. And the reason is pretty simple. Americans don't interact very often with American Muslims. So here we see, we asked the question, in the last 12 months, how often are you interacting with someone who's Muslim? We asked it of a bunch of different groups. And we see that roughly 7 to 10 say they either seldom or never had any contact with a Muslim in the last year. So we're really seeing that very few Americans are actually having close relationships with Muslims. And we know this is a really powerful factor in influencing attitudes. So it's affecting two different things. The first is knowledge. So not surprisingly, Americans don't know very many Muslims, don't interact with them, and they don't know a lot about the religious beliefs and practices of Muslims either. So only 9% say they know a lot, 61% say they know a little, and about 3 in 10 say they know nothing at all about the religious beliefs and practices of Muslims. And the interesting actual number here is that big 61% number. So most Americans don't interact regularly, but they claim they know at least a little bit about the religious beliefs and practices of Muslims. So the question is, well, where are they getting that information? And one of the things I'm going to focus on a little bit later in the talk is the role media plays in affecting attitudes. Okay. The other thing that we see it affecting is just general disposition towards Muslims. And here we see we have people rate a bunch of different religious groups, as well as gay and lesbian people. And we see that Muslims basically rank next to the bottom. Only atheists are ranked lower than Muslims in terms of sort of general favorability. Now this is, the way this works is we actually have people rank each group on a scale from 1 to 100, with 50 being the mean. And essentially, what we see is that most groups are above that 50 mark, so they're feeling at least somewhat warm. Atheists and Muslims are the only group that falls below that 50 mark, which means Americans overall, on average, feel fairly cool towards them. And I should note that for all these questions, the data that I'm presenting actually is asking about American Muslims. Because we know from other studies in our public opinion polls that are out that when you ask just about Muslims in general versus American Muslims, dispositions are much more negative when you talk about Muslims versus American Muslims. Okay, next I want to take a look at sort of American feelings about Muslim Americans in views of Islam. So in general, Americans are fairly ambivalent about public expressions of Muslim faith and presence of Muslims in society. We find a slim majority say they're comfortable with Muslim women wearing the burqa, and we actually defined this for people, so we didn't make them try to figure out what burqa meant. So we said clothing that covers their entire body, including their face. So 51% said they're comfortable with this, 48% said that this made them somewhat very uncomfortable. Similar numbers say that the mosque being built near their home, they'd be comfortable with that. 46% said they'd be uncomfortable with this. 53% said a group of Muslim men praying in an airport, they'd be comfortable with this. And 57% said they'd be comfortable with a Muslim teaching elementary school in their community. So we're really seeing a great degree of ambivalence about Muslim and expression of Muslim faith in American society. Part of the objections about the burqa really stem from this belief that somehow Islam is oppressive to women. In this slide, we look at that far left column, and this is we have people sort of say whether these phrases describe Muslims living in America well or not. And 69% says respectful of the rights of women does not describe Muslims living in the U.S. very well. 52% said that loyal to America does not describe American Muslims very well. 53% says describe that holds extreme political views describes Muslims very well. 59% embrace cultural practices like arranged marriages, and 81% say that having strong religious beliefs describes Muslims very well. And the interesting thing here is that, in general, religiosity is viewed very positively in this country. So we kind of want and expect our political leaders to have strong religious beliefs. Majority of Americans say that you need to, in order to be moral, you need to believe in God. But here, what we find is that, in the case of Muslims, being very religious is not necessarily a positive. Right, these are correlation coefficients. So what we're looking at here is that orange number. And believing that Muslims have strong religious beliefs and believing them they hold extreme political views are closely correlated. So the more likely you are to believe they have strong religious beliefs, the more likely you are to believe that they have extreme political views. So in this case, it's really a negative, that close association. I know that some of the other panelists are going to talk about otherness, and I think part of what's going on with embracing arranged marriages is also about kind of otherness, that they're different, distinct, not really part of American society. The last thing for this section I want to talk about is the issue of Islam and violence. This slide basically shows that 4 in 10 Americans say that, or agree, or somewhat agree that Islam encourages violence more than other religions. Roughly 1 in 5 say they don't. The interesting part here is we have that big gray wedge. So 38% of Americans offer basically no opinion. They say I neither agree nor disagree. And there's certainly a number of Americans there that are saying, I don't know enough about Islam to really render a valid judgment. But there are a significant number who are likely also just not unwilling to communicate to an interview or when they're talking to them on the phone that they actually hold or harbor these views. So in order to get at this degree to which Americans think this, we actually conducted a survey experiment where we asked people whether American or Christians who commit acts of violence in the name of Christianity are really Christian, and Muslims who commit acts of violence in the name of Islam are really Muslim. And then we conducted this shortly after the mass shootings in Norway in 2011. There's a public debate over whether it's accurate to describe this person who was Christian as a Christian terrorist. And there were a number of political commentators and media commentators that really took exception to the label, particularly Bill O'Reilly, who said, no, by definition, if this person committed mass killings, cannot be Christian. But at the same time said that, well, Muslims who did this could still be classified as Muslim. And what we found is a lot of Americans actually agreed with this. Right? They did hold Muslims and Christians to a double standard. So 83% says people who claim to be Christian and commit acts of violence in the name of Christianity are not Christian. But only 48% rejected this same principle when it came to Muslims. So we're really seeing that when it comes to the issue of violence in Islam and Muslims, it's a real problem. Now I want to talk a little bit about some sources of attitudes towards Islam and Muslims. Views of Muslims are highly politically polarized. So we see sharp divides between Democrats and Republicans, which is perhaps not surprising because on nearly every issue Americans are polarized these days. But this is particularly interesting. And also I want to point out the Tea Party, which hold actually more extreme views than Republicans. So 45% of Republicans say that American Muslims want to establish Sharia law, compared to only 22% of Democrats. 54% of Republicans say that Muslims are not an important part of the religious community, compared to 35% of Democrats. And more than 6 in 10 Republicans say that Islam is at odds with American values and way of life. The other thing I would point out is if you look where independents are, we actually see sort of asymmetrical polarization in that we see independents actually more lining up with Democrats and the rest of the general public, while Republicans, and particularly the Tea Parties, are sort of out on their own. The other thing that is really influencing attitudes is media consumption. So in a lot of our surveys, we asked folks, what is the most trusted source of television media? I'm running through a range of topics, including public television, MSNBC, CNN, the broadcast news outlets, which is ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox News. And here we see a significant effect of which media people most trust. So for instance, and I'm sure it's very easy to see, the big red bar stands out. So majority of Americans who say they most trust Fox News say that Muslims want to establish Sharia law. 6 in 10 say American Muslims are not an important part of the U.S. religious community. And more than 2/3 say that the values of Islam are at odds with American values and way of life. And interestingly, if you look at the other media outlets, there's really no pattern, and they're just much, much lower. The only real pattern you see for media consumption, at least when it comes to television media, is this what we call this Fox News effect. Unless you think this is just sort of politics, right? So conservatives and Republicans are more likely to be trusting and watching Fox News. We actually looked among Republicans by media source, and we found that this effect still is evident. So, for instance, 7 in 10 Republicans who most trust Fox News say that Islam is at odds with American values and way of life. Republicans who trust other media outlets, only 49% agree with the statement. Nearly as many, 44%, disagree. So we're seeing that the media consumption and media trust has basically an independent effect on attitudes towards Muslims. Okay, so that was a whole raft of kind of bad news if you really care about this issue. But there's sort of reasons for you to be optimistic as well. First off, is that we see, in general, Americans are generally pretty well disposed towards believing that cultural difference, cultural pluralism is a good thing. In this question we asked about the growing number of newcomers coming to American society, whether it strengthens American society or threatens traditional American values. Right? So 53% say that no, immigrants coming to American society actually strengthen American culture and values, while a significant minority, 42%, reject this idea. And we actually see this is particularly true among younger people who are among the most religiously and ethnically diverse. They see much greater value in sort of cultural pluralism. Secondly, there's an acknowledgement among the public that Muslims in this country are facing a significant amount of discrimination. So nearly 6 in 10 say that Muslims are facing a lot of discrimination. That's more than any other group, save gay and lesbian people, among whom 64%. So the interesting thing is if you actually look, if you remember earlier, so Muslims, atheists, and Mormons are all sort of viewed somewhat similar, kind of negatively. Atheists are viewed mostly negatively. But Americans don't see that atheists and Mormons are actually facing discrimination, where they see Muslims are facing a significant amount of discrimination. Americans also have significant reservations about how Muslims are characterized in society. So Americans are generally acknowledge that 6 in 10 here say that Americans agree that too many Americans believe that Muslims are terrorists. Only about 1 in 10 disagree. Again, we see that gray wedge in there, so there's a number of people who aren't offering an opinion, but even with those folks, we see that 6 in 10 Americans agree with this statement. So I think that's another cause. So there's a sort of a general acknowledgement that this is an issue. Lastly, most Americans, despite sort of the negative feelings they have towards Muslims, currently acknowledge that American Muslims are an important part of the religious community, and this is probably only likely to increase because we see significant generational divides. 6 in 10 millennials, 1829, agree with the statement compared to only 44% of seniors. So we are seeing sort of generational shifts, and so through the process of generational replacement, when seniors move off, and then millennials move into the electorate and become greater influence in society, I think we're going to start to see some of this change. And with that, I will turn it over.
Thank you. Our second speaker is Haris Taran, the director of the Washington, D.C. office of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. In his capacity as the D.C. director of MPAC, he engages various agencies within government, including the White House, Department of Justice, State Department, Department of Homeland Security, and offices on Capitol Hill. This past summer, President Obama called and then met with Haris as a leading young American to discuss policies pertaining to national security, countering violent extremism, the American Muslim community, and civic engagement. Haris has been published in various national and international publications, including the LA Times, CNN, and has a regular column on the Huffington Post. Haris is a USC Georgetown AMCLI Fellow and is also the author of Intro to Muslim America. Haris.
Thank you, Tim. Since we started off on that really positive and upbeat note, we'll kind of continue. But thank you so much. I think those numbers are quite eye-opening, and it's important to kind of think through some of those numbers. So what I'll try to do is to kind of take those numbers and give a little bit of context to some of them. Because it can seem, when you kind of look at those numbers and out of context, they may seem overwhelming. They are overwhelming, but it's important to put a little bit of context to these numbers in terms of the perceptions of American Muslims. So I'll focus on that perception and kind of the evolution of perception towards American Muslims and Muslims in general. I think American Muslims have an added stigma that at this point in their evolution in the American family and mosaic, they still carry the responsibility of being closely tied to what takes place, not only within the confines of the borders of the U.S., but also the events that happen even halfway across the world. So there's a level of ownership that American Muslims have of what takes place across the world, and some of these numbers are impacted by that, unfortunately. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that dynamic, and then go into maybe what some of the solutions are moving forward as we kind of see these numbers. The first thing I like to generally start off with is talk about the issue of trauma. And people say, what do you mean by trauma? I mean, these questions were asked from the American public. So these questions were posed to members of the American public and then responded by the members of the American public. Americans who have been impacted by various interactions, they perceived interactions with Islam and Muslims. So what is important is if you look politically at kind of the history of the American public's interaction with what they perceive to be Islam, Muslims, it's been quite traumatic. And if you kind of go back a little bit, if you start with the oil embargo, and some might say, well, how is that related to Islam and the perceptions of of Muslims? It is, because symbolism is extremely important, especially when we talk about perception. Symbolism is extremely important. So when we talked about the oil embargo in the 70s, there was this perception that America at that point was at odds with this region that was Muslim, and the symbols were Muslim and Islamic. That happened. And then you had the 79 revolution in Iran, and the coming to power of Khomeini and the Islamic Revolution, which was also another very traumatic interaction of the American public with what they perceived to be the symbols of Islam and Muslims, where you had the Ayatollah, you had people who were yelling and shouting "Death to America," at the same time claiming to be a representative of their faith, and so there was that public interaction that took place. And if you continue to kind of move along, you had specific events in the 80s that took place. There was the bombings in Lebanon. There was also other incidents that took place, and then of course you had the first Gulf War, and that's when I had my first public. I was in middle school, and I remember very distinctly that growing up in Southern California, and Southern California is quite diverse. So, but growing up in Southern California, it was during the first Gulf War where I realized this otherization effect. That someone came to me and pointed out to me that I was a Muslim, and I was like, okay. And how did they point out that I was a Muslim? They said, "You're Saddam Hussein's cousin." I was like, okay. A scuffle took place as would in middle school. But that's when the first time that I realized that there's something a little bit different that's taking place currently. Prior to that, I hadn't my identity, my Islamic identity, or my Middle Eastern identity, whatever you might call it, and that conflation unfortunately takes place, had not been pointed out to me. I just thought I was a kid growing up in Southern California, but that was the first time that otherization effect took place. And then, of course, you had 9/11, and that was a very traumatic experience for the American public. And the symbols of 9/11 were extremely vivid. The symbols of 9/11 were men in beards, were men who were claiming a legitimacy of faith, men who were claiming legitimacy in religious texts and declaring essentially a religious war. And so that was the most vivid public interaction of the American public with what they perceived to be Islam and Muslims. And I generally tend to give the American public a lot of room. I think the American public, they're very open and receptive to accepting of diversity and change to a large extent. So what happened, and what's interesting, and this is where I'll move to the next part of my presentation, is, but even immediately after 9/11, there wasn't a major shift of negative attitudes toward Muslims. It was interesting. Why? You can point out certain reasons, but there wasn't. Well, the Washington Post did a poll at that point asking the American public about their attitudes towards Muslims and Islam, they framed it. And you had generally overwhelming positive perception. So you had about 67% of Americans believe that American Muslims, or the religion of Islam, was not responsible for 9/11, and that they had favorable attitudes towards them. What was interesting was that you had certain, this was a couple of weeks after 9/11, but there was some political will and leadership that was taking place at that point. I don't know if you remember, President Bush actually went into a mosque. He went into a mosque in Washington, D.C., was very, very public about his support for American Muslims, and he said that the American Muslim community could not be blamed for what took place, and that they were part of the American mosaic and American family. And so there was this deliberate, and I remember those conversations taking place extremely vividly. So there was a deliberate conversation. And in the State of the Union, he mentioned the American Muslim community. He met with American Muslim leaders. He met with a couple of American Muslim imams. And so there was this conversation that was taking place. And so the public saw that and said, okay, we're getting this from our political leaders. And so there was a response. The public generally had this view towards American Muslims and Islam in general that was favorable. So then we continued to after 9/11. That was immediately after 9/11. But there was an interesting shift that took place. There was quite an interesting shift that took place. The further you move away from 9/11, the more negative the perceptions of American Muslims get in the public. And the correlation between the increased discrimination as well. So I'm not going to focus on the discrimination, I'm focusing on the perception, but there is a correlation between the increased negative perception and the discrimination of the American Muslim community. And you can see this in the numbers of the FBI hate crime, the annual hate crimes report. You can see this in the HUD annual housing discrimination report. You can see this in the employment discrimination reports that take place. If you see it right after 9/11, those numbers tend to kind of stay the same. But as you get further away from 9/11, you'll see that the discrimination, actual discrimination, also increases, and there's a correlation with the perception issue. What was interesting was, as we moved away from 9/11, these attitudes started to get a bit more negative. And the analysis that we make, and what we kind of see is that at that point is when the political leadership and political will kind of dropped. And this is where the politicization of the American Muslim community and Islam in general started to happen. So what I would generally do is, if the general American public has apprehension towards Islam or Muslims, I wouldn't call them bigots. I would not. I wouldn't call them Islamophobes. I wouldn't. Because there's a general apprehension. There's been traumatic experiences. There was 9/11. There was impacts that took place where you can realize, you can say that there is a general apprehension. But it's mostly based on curiosity, a little bit based on fear. And so that's acceptable. And I think that's where there's a lot of room for the positive engagement that you talked about, social interaction that can take place, that can impact that in a positive manner and actually help move those feelings along. But the problem is as we got further away from 9/11, there was an industry that developed that specifically pushed an anti-Muslim agenda. And that's where we saw the politicization take place. So if you have general apprehension, people are a bit wary based on public events. There is already a sense of, that, we don't know who this group is. This group is a bit foreign to us, although American Muslims are not foreign, and we can go into that a little bit later. But there's a group that saw an opening, a cognitive opening in the American public's view and perception of Muslims. And the Center for American Progress has done a report called Fear Inc., which is extremely important if you're able to look at that report. And that report documents, since 9/11, the amount of funding, of close to $50 million, that have gone into kind of pseudo think tanks, individuals, that have been specifically pushing an anti-Muslim agenda. It's about $50 million over the past 10 years. And it's deliberate. And there's different stakeholders. There are the public folks who come out and who are very sensationalist. So they'll come out, they'll talk about American Muslims, that there being too many mosques in America, and that there being too many Muslims in America. So they generally will try to push the conversation as extreme as possible. And so what will happen is they will come out publicly, but then you have these individuals in the background who are writing and impacting specifically national security policy. And I think the conflation of the American Muslim community and national security policy has impacted that perception issue as well. So what needs to happen, I think, for us to address this issue is, yes, there is the apprehension that the American public had, but then there's a specific industry that has developed. And that industry does not care about marginalization of American Muslims. They do not care about the public perception of American Muslims. It's very deliberate for them because they have certain political, social, and even religious agendas that see any engagement of the American Muslim community in the civic and political mainstream of America as problematic. And they'll say that. If American Muslims are part of the civic and political framework of America, that's a problem. They'll say that very publicly. And so they'll push things like the anti-Sharia bills. They'll push things, for a while there was this conversation that, even now, just this past week, there's this report that John Brennan is a secret Muslim. Right, that John Brennan is a secret Muslim and that he had converted to Islam in the 90s, and the president kind of appointed him in that position at on his national security team, and now is sending him to the CIA to kind of complete that mission of Muslim subversion, right, of the Constitution, what they call lawfare. And there are theories like this that are out there, and it just does not take place kind of in the blogosphere. It actually at times moves into the public conversation. It would be one thing if this kind of dialogue or discourse was focused only in the extreme blogosphere. You could see that happening, and that happened with every community. But when that starts to shift and become part of the public and mainstream conversation, even if people are just saying, there's a possibility, or there's a report that starts to perpetuate this fear that there's this Muslim fifth column out there trying to destroy America from within. So that conflation of national security policy and the American Muslim community started to take place around 2005, 2006. And what happened in 2006, which was interesting, was for the first time we saw an elected official use anti-Muslim sentiment as part of their platform, part of their electoral platform. So there was a representative from North Carolina who talked about national security and how Muslims are a threat in this country. And there was not much pushback. There was not much pushback from his party, although he was not successful. And this is what the interesting thing is, that the elected officials, or those who run for office, who run on an anti-Muslim agenda, a very extreme anti-Muslim agenda, generally are not extremely successful. And we even saw this in 2012, and I'll go into a couple of cases. But what they do is they push the conversation to the right into the extreme. So kind of moving back from that becomes a little bit more difficult. So 2006 is where we saw for the first time in midterm elections this, politicization of the American Muslim community. We saw it increase in 2008. So there's a correlation with election cycles. In 2008, at that point, candidate Obama was being accused of being Muslim. There was about 18% of the Republican electorate who believed he was Muslim, and this was kind of taking place. Although he was successful and there was a bit of pushback, those sentiments continued to remain high. And in 2010, we kind of saw the culmination of all of those sentiments take place around the so-called Ground Zero Mosque. And the case of Terry Jones, the pastor who wanted to burn the Quran. So you had this very public and political conversation, to an extent where the DOJ had to actually go into a lawsuit because in Tennessee there was a mosque. There's a community who had a mosque for about 15 years already, and they wanted to expand the mosque. They wanted to get permits, and they were going through the zoning laws and the zoning process, and there was pushback. And so the DOJ had to step in and write a legal brief saying that Islam was actually a religion. Because the proponents of this anti-Sharia bill had said that Islam is not a religion; it's a political identity. It's a political party and identity, and so that's why we have the right to push back against the local mosque. But the DOJ had to step in and write a brief, and the DOJ was quite, I was talking to some friends who had written that, and they were quite happy. I was like, you just stated that Islam is a religion, but that's kind of the extent of the conversation. So this very public conflation of Islam and politics and national security law has taken place over the past 10 years. And there hasn't been much pushback from political leaders and officials. And I think that's where the responsibility on a lot of the public officials is extremely important, because when the latest event happened, where Huma Abedin, the assistant to Secretary Clinton, was accused of being part of the Muslim Brotherhood, and a few other Muslim members in government were accused of being part of the Muslim Brotherhood, there was a pushback from within the Republican Party. So Senator John McCain, got onto the floor of the Senate, and he said, "This is ridiculous. This is unacceptable." Michelle Bachmann, who had made that initial claim, her former presidential campaign manager, came out with an op-ed on Fox News and said this is absolutely ridiculous. The speaker, John Boehner himself, said this is extremely dangerous. When that happened, there was immediate pushback, and that conversation kind of died down. And so you saw more people within the Republican Party at that point say, okay, this is unacceptable. And that conversation started to take place. So you can see that when public officials and political leaders actually step in and fill that vacuum of leadership, there's a change in that sentiment that takes place. That's why their role and their responsibility is so important. Now, kind of moving forward, what are some of the solutions? Number one, the good news is that generally, as I said before, the American public does not have a lot of appetite in general for extreme rhetoric and extreme politics when it comes to at the national level. And so in this last presidential elections in 2012, we saw a few of the most ardent anti-Muslim kind of bigots at the national level. They weren't successful. So you had someone like Alan West, who was extremely anti-Muslim. His rhetoric was very extreme. It wasn't just the Muslim rhetoric. The Muslim rhetoric was part of it. He called like 90 members of the Democratic Party. He accused them of being communist and socialist. So it was extreme rhetoric in general. He lost his seat in Florida. Joe Walsh, who had said that Muslims, he had a town hall meeting, and in that town hall meeting, he said that your Muslim neighbors can potentially kill you. I mean, they're out to get you. And right away, right after that, this is a correlation between discrimination and perception. In Illinois, we saw a spat of hate crimes against American Muslim institutions. So there was a shooting at a mosque. There was multiple things that took place at that moment. So you see that connection between rhetoric, public rhetoric, and hate crimes and discrimination specifically. He lost his seat. Michelle Bachmann, who has been in that seat for quite a long time, she came from a safe district. She outspent her opponent almost 11-1, and still barely won by 3,000 votes. So that's a sign that the American public in general, when they realize what they're being fed or given, they'll tend to think, okay, this is crazy. This is a little extreme. I don't want to necessarily go there. And so that's why that differentiation between the industry of anti-Muslim bigotry and the general apprehension of the public is important to make. Because if anyone who has any type of fear or apprehension, is made to sound to be a bigot, that's a problem. And I think we need to make that differentiation very specifically. Moving forward, what's the solution? The solution, well, is for everyone to befriend a Muslim. But there's not enough Muslims to go around. It's just not. The numbers show there's anywhere between, some of the conservative numbers, maybe 4 million and a little bit less, even 8 million. So there's just not enough Muslims to go around to have a personal relationship and interaction with folks. But what I think needs to happen is conversations like these need to continue to take place. Public conversations. And at times, they could be difficult. I mean, these conversations generally are not always smooth. But this is how you kind of build a sense of resilience within the general public, is when you have these conversations and you continue to talk about some of the underpinnings of these issues, when you deflate the politicization, national security laws from Islamic beliefs and Muslim beliefs, and then you also address some of the real issues. Yeah, there definitely are issues in some of the Muslim majority countries, because, like I said at the beginning, American Muslims unfortunately have this responsibility of having to respond to every act that takes place, whether in Saudi Arabia or in Iran or any other country, and so that deflation also needs to take place. But also having some of these real conversations. There are issues with the treatment of women. There are issues with the treatment of minorities. And when we have these conversations, publicly and kind of work through them, I think that's how you build a sense of resilience in the public. Who would then, when you have a Alan West or you have a Pam Geller or someone who comes on Fox News or wherever else and says crazy things, people will generally say, okay, I can differentiate between the crazies and not. So that's where I think that public conversation needs to take place. And as difficult as that Ground Zero Mosque conversation was in the public, it was quite a difficult conversation. I remember that time, and it was not fun. But really, what it did was it created a coalition of faith leaders, of political leaders who said, I think we might be pushing this a little bit. I mean, when Mayor Bloomberg came out and said we can't have a religious-free zone for one community in America, that was quite powerful. I mean, that was extremely powerful. He said we can't have one. And he said, I know this. I know that in about 300-400 years ago, there was someone saying we couldn't have a synagogue in New York City, and we're not going to allow that to take place. And George Washington himself wrote against that. And we're not going to allow that to take place. When you have these public conversations like that, it builds a sense of resilience within the American public. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Our third speaker is an alum from Washington University School of Law. Our third panelist, Amara Chaudhry, has dedicated her legal career to the struggle for civil rights and equality and focuses her practice at the intersection of law and race, religion, gender, ethnicity, and national origin, primarily in the context of the criminal justice system. She currently serves as the Civil Rights Director and Staff Attorney for the Council on American Islamic Relations Philadelphia office. In her current position, Amara focuses her practice on governmental discrimination against American Muslims. Mara's ongoing projects include anti-Sharia legislation in Pennsylvania and nationwide, anti-Muslim profiling by the NYPD throughout the northeastern United States, security clearance denials of federal employees related to their identity as American Muslims, the official non-engagement policy of the FBI against Muslim organizations nationwide, anti-Muslim discrimination by state and federal prisons, and anti-Muslim discrimination by private employers. So, please welcome.
Good morning, everybody. So, as I was preparing to come here today and I looked at the topic of where we are, where we've been, and where we're going, I decided that was too broad for me and I needed to narrow it a little bit. So I want to focus specifically on the increasing criminalization of American Muslim identity post 9/11, which is separate and distinct from what Ms. Hollander will be speaking about later, the criminalization of American Muslim organizations. Because I assure you, I did not want to rush to the podium today to talk about my own organization in that context. But when I speak about the criminalization of American Muslim identity, what I want to focus on specifically is the extent to which that criminalization is affected by a racial element or a racial component. Now, this somewhat dovetails on the theory that Horace had mentioned earlier about the otherization, alienation of American Muslim identity. And that is this belief that American Muslims are perpetually foreign others. And that is a belief that is shared not only by the American Muslim community, but many Americans ascribe those same feelings to persons who have ancestry from other parts of Asia. So it's called the Asian otherization. But I actually believe that discrimination against American Muslims, as well as just generally anti-Muslim bias and sentiment in the United States, is multifaceted and complex. Some of it is based upon actual or perceived religious belief and practices. Some of it is based upon this belief that nearly 400 years after the arrival of the first African slaves on U.S. shores, American Muslims are still foreign and other. And some of it, I posit to you here today, is good old-fashioned race hate. America has a very long history with race hate, obviously. And 9/11 did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in a nation in which we have a long history of assuming that persons who belong to populations consisting mostly of individuals with black or brown skin have a higher propensity for violence and criminality. And so the question is, how much of that is a factor and how much of it are some of these other questions? So when I talk about where we are now, where we've been, and where we're going, I'm going to start by talking about, actually I'll demonstrate how that American Muslim identity has been criminalized post 9/11. I'll then segue into analyzing the criminalization of that identity within the larger context of America's racial history. And then where we're going, hopefully, I'll posit to you that understanding the nature of anti-Muslim bias, how can we effectively advocate for American Muslim legal equality? So beginning by speaking about where we are now, I'm going to assert what I believe to be an almost inarguable fact, the fact that American Muslim identity has been criminalized post 9/11. Now, when I speak about American Muslims, I want to be clear that I'm talking about Muslims living in the United States regardless of race, ethnicity, national origin, country of citizenship, whether immigrant, native born, or their familial history in the United States. So basically anyone who would either self-identifies or is identified by others as Muslim. That's what I'm talking about in the American Muslim category. When I speak about criminalization, I'm speaking about an explicit, implicit, or even unconscious use of Muslim identity as an ex ante basis for predicting the propensity for violence and criminal behavior. Ex ante meaning before the event. So assuming that because someone is Muslim, they have a propensity for violence or criminal behavior is what I'm talking about in terms of criminalization. And when I talk about racialization, my analysis is whether Muslims have indeed, we are being understood according to the black-white binary racialization process here in the United States as opposed to being a dangerous exotic other. So as I begin talking about the fact that American Muslim identity has been criminalized post 9/11, I want to make sure I provide some examples so that we do in fact agree that our identity has in fact been criminalized. We see examples everywhere. We begin with FBI surveillance of Muslim organizations. This includes mosques and community centers, which contain both a sanctuary religious space as well as a social hall. It includes religious and civic organizations, such as CARE and other national organizations, and includes even the neighborhood coffee shop or tea house, which is frequented by American Muslims. Other examples of criminalization is local law enforcement surveillance. And for example, the NYPD has conducted surveillance from Pennsylvania to Connecticut, and specifically has targeted both mosques and Muslim student associations at universities, including the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. We see the criminalization of American Muslims at both airports. And I will say that actually DHS and TSA does indeed have a civil rights department where you can file a complaint. But nonetheless, we see this behavior at airports and at borders, both the Canadian and Mexican borders. We've also seen anti-Muslim trainings by law enforcement and the United States military. Pennsylvania, this came to my attention when the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Middle District of Pennsylvania, so that's Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, had a so-called intelligence specialist who put together a PowerPoint. I got that PowerPoint, and there was one slide that said, and I quote, "To understand Islamist terrorism, we need first to understand Islam." We also know that the United States military in 2012 pulled some slides which were characterized as declaring a war on Islam. I didn't actually see the words war on Islam, but there were certainly a lot of discussion about the nature of the faith itself and how it contributes to a propensity for violence. And of course, there is the criminalization of Muslim organizations. So organizations which seek to advocate for these individuals who've been criminalized in this way are themselves being subjected to surveillance and actually even sometimes being accused of wrongdoing. So these are the ways in which American Muslim identity has been criminalized, and almost all of this occurs in the post-9/11 world. So now let's analyze some of the possible explanations. Okay, so if Muslims are assumed to have a propensity for violence and criminal behavior, why is it? And is it, as I suggest, a racial bias, or is it something else? Well, let's look and see. When we speak about profiling at airports and borders, we're normally talking about individuals who are stopped, pulled aside, maybe even subjected to additional questioning or screening, simply because of things such as their name or their physical appearance, the so-called Muslim-looking people. In that case, well, it sure looks like a racialized practice, right? You could have converted to another faith months ago, but if your name is, I don't mean to pick on you, Horace Taran, you're still Horace Taran, you still look like you. This is going to happen.
I've had any issues there.
I'm saying, I'm just saying that's still a situation. Right. I had a gentleman, a client, stopped at the border. The questions by CBP were, what's your name? Can't remember if he was Muhammad Jamal or Jamal Muhammad, but my name's Muhammad Jamal. Where are you from? I'm from Norristown, PA. No, originally, where are you from? Pakistan. Come over here. He was eventually detained for just shy of 48 hours, which people who practice criminal law know 48 hours used to mean something in that context. So once again, we're looking at discrimination on the basis of what we call immutable characteristics. These individuals did not choose their physical appearance. They could possibly change their name, but then again, if my name were not Amara Chaudhry but Amanda Chaudhry, I'm sure people would still realize something was up with me. When we talk about the anti-Muslim training materials, both by the U.S. Attorney's Office and by the U.S. military, what struck me when I looked over the military training materials last night was the constant insinuation that there's no such thing as a moderate, in quotes, Muslim. Every PowerPoint slide that talked about moderate Muslims had the word moderate in quotation marks, and basically was suggesting that even persons who present themselves as being mainstream, I think that was also, it was in there but not in quotes, were like undercover in some way, or secretly trying to infiltrate mainstream American society for the purpose of perpetuating danger. So once again, if you think about what that says, it means even somebody who appears to be, whatever word you want to use, moderate or mainstream, seems to be not engaging in practices or behaviors that identifies them as Muslim, that they still have a Muslim identity. They're still being identified by, in this case, the U.S. military or the U.S. attorney's offices, both within the Department of Justice and Department of Defense, as still maintaining a Muslim identity. So once again, we're looking at something that looks increasingly racialized. However, it's not always that simple. Let's take, for example, FBI surveillance of mosque attendees, or the FBI has also expressed interest in my own practice to people who engage in proselytizing behavior in the name of Islam, who conduct basically a practice akin to Bible study. They meet at people's homes and they have prayer readings and prayer study, as well as often federal authorities in my part of Pennsylvania will ask people, when they are being questioned about possible links to terrorism, the extent to which they practice at home. Do they pray 5 times a day? Do they fast? Do they do things like this? So when you see that, you see a federal government agency now realizing, or maybe it's not as conscious, but not focusing upon the identity itself. Even if the identity got you into that home, now when they're analyzing whether or not you pose a threat to American society, they're looking at the degree to which you're religious. Now, in some ways that seems like, well, it shouldn't really matter, because when you're talking about a federal government agency, if you're like me, you're a litigator, if a government is discriminating against someone, it doesn't matter if it's religion or race, right? It's still strict scrutiny. You still get this very favorable standard. But as Americans, we do have an innate sense that discriminating against somebody for an immutable characteristic, which they cannot change, is just morally reprehensible. When you have an agency focusing upon religious observance and prayer, this looks more behavioral. Not only does this become a more socially acceptable practice, but actually even the FBI's internal operating guidelines itself draws that distinction. So the FBI has several internal guidelines, the Attorney General operating, domestic operating guidelines, the guidelines regarding the use of race. They also have guidelines relating to the gathering of intelligence, all of which say that you cannot use race, as I mentioned before, as an ex ante basis for predicting criminality. However, there is a distinction in which behavioral profiling is permitted. So this is why I bring this whole topic up, because at first it seems as though it doesn't matter if you're discriminating against someone for being Muslim. You've got a good lawsuit there anyway. But when you look at where the rubber hits the road, the reality of everyday life for communities who are being marginalized, as well as attorneys who advocate for them, is how often do you get to file a 1983 lawsuit? I mean, like, really honestly, how often do you get to do it? Your plaintiff shows up, everything happens. But you do have more of an opportunity to work on the policies themselves, as far as an impact do, as CARE does, other organizations. And the mindset of federal officials, I have a very dear friend of mine who, he's always been a prosecutor while I was a defense attorney, but now he works for Maine Justice and Counterterrorism. I work for CARE, who is very convinced in his mind, no, it would be wrong to discriminate against someone for being Arab, Persian, Turkish, North African, South Asian. However, it's okay to target someone for being Muslim. That's different. They choose to be Muslim. You don't choose to be South Asian or Arab or something along those lines. So we also, then I was going to talk about organizations, but we'll save that. So we know that this is where we are now, that Muslims are being targeted. We're being targeted both on the basis of our immutable characteristics as well as mutable characteristics such as beliefs and behavior. I'd like to discuss Muslim identity within the larger context of America's racial history. Now, I've actually been researching this topic for probably over a year, and what I found is quite striking to me that there's no clear definition of race in America's legal history. I looked really hard to find it. I was really amazed. The preeminent textbook on this was written by Omi and Winan. It's called Racial Formation in the United States. And even there, though race itself is not defined, racism is. Racism is described by saying racism exists when one ethnic group or historical collectivity dominates, excludes, or seeks to eliminate another on the basis of differences that it believes to be hereditary and unalterable. So I like that language about historical collectivity, because what we do know, whether we call Muslim Americans or the greater Middle East, Middle Eastern Americans, whatever term we use, we must acknowledge that a new group identity has formed, that group is being marginalized, and that another collectivity is engaging in that process of marginalization. I can also say that when you look at both case law as well as social understanding generally, the concept of race in American history seems to coincide historically around two factors, either skin color itself, we all remember the Plessy v. Ferguson case, or what's called common understanding, which of course isn't explained in any decision because it's commonly understood, and so then you're still left with not knowing how to define race. Now, of course, when I speak about America's racial history, we know that many states, including the Commonwealth of Virginia here, worked very hard to define race at one point in our history. And I looked over some of my older research on the Jim Crow era, and I found some interesting statutes. A Virginia statute back in 1912 indicated that the preservation of public morals, public health, and public order in cities and towns in this Commonwealth is endangered by the residence of white and colored people in close proximity to one another. Now, while that sounds archaic, I like the language of talking about the preservation of public morals, public health, and public order, because as I speak to you guys this afternoon about the so-called anti-Sharia laws, you'll see that this language is very closely mirrored in the 2011-2012 anti-Sharia law movement. But this idea that we need to protect the public good by making sure that people are kept in their distinct spheres. But then other laws go a little bit further. So I'm looking at both a Georgia statute as well as a municipal ordinance in Atlanta, one of which restricts the use of public parks to white women and children only, and one which relates to African American barbers not being allowed to serve women or children under 14. And what I think those statutes do when you read the entire body of Jim Crow laws collectively is, one, they pretty obviously point out this assumption that African Americans have a higher propensity for violence and criminality. And they sort of set this bar as to the common racial understanding of the United States throughout the first few centuries of our history, in associating that groups of people comprised mostly of dark-skinned persons have this high propensity for violence and criminality. That was extended, of course, to persons who may not necessarily look, in the language of that time, colored, again in air quotes. But if you belong to a group that was mostly consisting of such persons, you had this higher propensity for violence. Well, that's all well and good, but that's talking about Jim Crow. What's that got to do with us? What's that got to do with modern-day Muslim Americans? I won't go quite to the present as yet, but I will go to the racial prerequisite cases. And what these are is, from 1790 to 1952, the Naturalization Act limited citizenship to what was called free white persons. It was later broadened in 1870 to include persons of African descent. So what happened then, if you were trying to immigrate from the greater Middle East, which has various definitions, but you can probably guess what it is, North Africa, expanding possibly out to the Indian subcontinent in the east, and even north to the Caucasus mountain regions in Western Asia, Eastern Europe. So I have several cases which I thought were very interesting in the fact that religion was used to help determine whether someone was a free white person if they were immigrating from this region known as the larger Middle East. The first case I want to talk about is In re Hassan in 1942, which I believe is the District of Massachusetts. I'll have to double check. But in that case, a Yemeni Muslim was petitioning the court for citizenship. Now, he had looked at the case law before, and he was all prepared to show that even though, as the court noticed, he was extremely dark-skinned, he could prove that his ancestry came from Northern Europe. This was a common tactic at the time where people would say, yes, I'm dark-skinned today, but I'm descended from the so-called Aryan peoples of Northern Europe. And the court was like, yeah, that's well and good, I don't really care. And what they actually said is that they decided that he was not a free white person, but not because he was dark-skinned, but because he came from a region of the world where Islam was being practiced. The court specifically said, apart from the dark skin of the Arabs, it is well known that they are part of the Mohammedan world, which was an archaic term for Muslim, the Mohammedan world, and that a wide gulf separates their culture from that of the predominantly Christian peoples of Europe. Now, if you think about that, that case took place in 1942. Now, where in the world was a government that was determining racial purity on the basis of religion, right? But obviously we were half a world away, and this did not affect the way we decided cases. Another case preceding, so the First World War era, in Ray Ellis, 1910, a Syrian immigrant was allowed to obtain citizenship as a free white person because, as the court noted, he was reared a Catholic and is still of that faith. More interesting generally are the cases involving Armenian immigrants during this time period. One case I note in Ray Pelagian says, the Armenians have generally been found on the European side by reason of their Christianity. They generally ranged themselves against the Persian fire worshippers and against the Mohammedans. And so we have this assumption that because Armenians, regardless of an individual's own religious belief, come from a Christian majority world, they are white. Syrians, as it sort of played out, Muslims were generally found to not be white. Christians were. And then, of course, our poor Yemeni gentleman who really worked hard to prove his racial purity fell short because of his faith and the faith of that part of the world. So there is a history in the United States of race being used to determine, religion being used to determine racial identity. And the way I talk about this is interesting. The In re Hassan took place in 1942. Let's actually think about the Third Reich for a moment. Remember that Jewish identity was often determined by ancestry. If you were born a Jew, you were a Jew. You could try to convert your way out of it, you were still a Jew. When we talk about the Spanish Inquisition and the racial purity laws there, again, if you were born either a Muslim or a Jew, you were that faith. You could not convert out. When you look at the cases during the early part of the 20th century in the United States, we see this same mentality, this idea that it is impossible to convert out because they don't even care what religion these applicants were. They're just saying, you come from that part of the world, hence you are not one of us. You are not a free white person, but hence not an American. We also know, because we're talking about the Naturalization Act, remember, you could come in as either a free white person or being of African ancestry. So from the late 1700s all the way into the mid-1900s, we do understand that America is still understanding race in the context of the black-white binary. We don't have time to go through this fully today, but I would posit to you, I believe America still understands race within the context of the black-white binary, which puts Muslim Americans who come from the greater Middle East in an interesting bind, and even African Americans. But like I said, we're short on time. I'm going to talk about where we're going. So if we understand that discrimination against American Muslims to some degree has a racial component, what do we do? And I would posit to you that many individuals and organizations that seek to advocate for American Muslim equality make one of two mistakes. We either ignore or underestimate the importance of race in understanding why we are being affected, or we boldly assert that anti-Muslim hate is race hate without any information to back it up. And I'll give an example of what I mean. We will hear later about how organizations that represent American Muslims, when they themselves consist of Muslim majority populations, have been targeted to some degree by federal law enforcement. Now, what I'd like to point out is that in the 1960s, the FBI conducted surveillance of the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the surveillance was based upon this theory that these organizations had been infiltrated by communists, right? So let's think about what that means. Okay. 1960s America. The FBI identifies several organizations which are, one, representing the largest marginalized population in the United States, and two, consist largely of persons who belong to that race or that group. And they accuse those organizations of being infiltrated by anti-American forces with an agenda of overthrowing the U.S. government. And that's what an allegation of communism was. It was 1960s America. Post 9/11, we're hearing the same allegations that organizations that represent a large minority group, large marginalized group, as long as the organizations themselves consist of members of that group, have been infiltrated by anti-American forces with an agenda of overthrowing the U.S. government. It's not really a very different history, but we often don't hear it described in that way. So when I talk about going forward, one of the mistakes I mentioned was that many organizations will boldly assert that anti-Muslim hate is race hate without really backing it up. And one of the things I've heard a lot is organizations and individuals supporting things such as the End Racial Profiling Act, working with the FBI to revise its guidelines regarding the use of race in domestic FBI organizations, but not really ever trying to explain that anti-Muslim hate is race hate. And I think that's problematic because you do lose a sense of America's larger racial history. Because America does understand race according to the black-white binary, you're going to have a group that is somewhat seen as not being part of that history and thus not subjected to the same issues. The final issue when I talk about that organizations and individuals who advocate for American Muslims ignore or underestimate the use of race is when people focus entirely on the religious aspect. What they end up doing is downplaying the fact that much of the discrimination is based upon immutable characteristics that are beyond people's control. So when you say that the problem is a lack of knowledge or lack of social interaction, you're assuming that we have the ability to stop all this bias through our interaction. If it's based upon immutable characteristics, it may be something beyond our control. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you very much. I want to send my thanks to each of the panelists. What I want to do is I'll open with one question, and I want to open it up to the audience for you to ask questions that you may have for the panelists. And this first question basically sort of combines some of the things that both Harrison and Amara said. And I want to ask this, and it focuses on the language of leadership, national leadership, and then the actions, the words and the actions of the national government. So, as mentioned, it was 9 days after 9/11, President Bush gave an address to a joint session of Congress. And in that address, he said the following, this is a quote, "I also want to speak tonight directly to Muslims throughout the world. We respect your faith. It's practiced freely by many millions of Americans, and by millions more in countries that America counts as friends. Its teachings are good and peaceful, and those who commit evil in the name of Allah blaspheme the name of Allah. The terrorists are traitors to their own faith, trying in effect to hijack Islam itself. The enemy of America is not our many Muslim friends. It is not our many Arab friends." So that was 9 days after 9/11, and then in the first term of President Obama's administration, he gave his famous speech in Cairo. And so my question is this, and that is that, Harris, you talk about the importance of the statements of national leadership on how the public perceives Islam, but then Amaro talked about actions taken by, say, the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security and other governmental organizations. And first of all, for all the panelists, does national leadership need to say more at this point? And is there an impact if what they say does not correspond with what the government does? So I guess we could go right down. If whoever wants to start, or we can start with Dan.
Sure. Well, I think from the data I showed and from what we've seen, and what Horace mentioned, I mean, the politicization of views on Islam did not immediately happen after 9/11. Bush's leadership was pretty exemplary in many respects. But I did think that, and it was not even up through his end of his term. I think that even up into his second term, you saw there wasn't as much rhetoric on it. And you saw sort of elements in the media and other sort of particularly conservative and Republican officials sort of using it for political gain, so using anti-Muslim rhetoric for campaigns to gain political clout or political power. And so I think that if you look at the data, what you've seen now is sort of Democratic positions on this issue being relatively stable during that period, but Republicans becoming much more negative from 2002 to 2012-13. I think it's because of that leadership. In fact, so you don't even have politicians that are sort of, like Bush did, sort of saying, we can't paint these groups as, as one and the same. You're seeing that Republican officials and conservatives in media saying, no, in fact, voicing very negative sentiment about Muslims, and I think that's having an effect that's being trickled down to partisans on both sides.
So, what I would say is the following. I'd make the statement: rhetoric creates environment for bad policy. That's the first thing that I'd say. Of course, following 9/11, we all knew, anyone who understands how national security policy is made in the U.S., and historically how national security policy is made, we knew that our government was going to overreact. I mean, that's what government does, unfortunately, especially when it comes to national security policy. And part of the problem is that once you legislate national security policy, it's very hard to roll it back. And that's historically, we've known that. So rhetoric leads to an environment where bad policy is created. And why do I say that? And why it's important to understand rhetoric and perception is that when you look at the training issue, the government didn't deliberately come up with bad training. I mean, if you speak to folks, you've been in the DHS, we've worked with the CRCL. I mean, you guys did some great work with reaching out to Muslim communities, and CRCL was definitely one of the champions of that. Our friends in government weren't like, oh, okay, we want to go look for the bad training that exists out there and then give that bad training to our agents and our government employees. No, that's why I talked about the industry. The way our government functions is that we rely on information to make policy. And government will not always create that information and then base policy on it. A lot of times you have contractors. And what happened was the contractor field was saturated by anti-Muslim bigots. That's just fact. I mean, the DHS has done an amazing job now of revamping it. And I think they've done exemplary, they've been a model of purging all of that anti-Muslim training and really coming up with in-house training that's helping even local law enforcement agencies come up with better training. So what had happened was when you had these contractors, I remember I was in a meeting in Stockholm, and it was a national security conference. And so I was sitting around the table and we're having a conversation, and you had former intelligence officers who focused on the Cold War. And you can tell that these guys, after the Cold War had ended, were basically out of work and nothing to do. And these guys were looking for something to do. I mean, they were just like, there was a lot of these guys around, and they were KGB folks, they were, CIA folks, they were independent analysts, everybody was around the table. And so, these guys, and I heard it from them, they said, you know what, we didn't anticipate the next threat to be this, so we had to catch up, and we had to get our information overnight and start to actually formulate trainings and workshops, and that's literally what happened. Was right after September 11th, you had people who said, okay, I've got some experience in training and intelligence and national security. I'm going to take what's out there, and the majority, you've got unfortunately you had this and you still have a gap of information. You've got this vacuum of information on Islam and Muslims and national security law and all of this. And so you had individuals who stepped in right away and provided extremely problematic training. And based on that problematic training, you had problematic policy. So NYPD is a perfect example of that. The NYPD, their material was based on extremely problematic training. Extremely problematic training. You had contractors come in and say, yeah, Muslims, when you go to a hookah bar, this is a place where terrorists gather in a hookah bar and have conversations, and so the NYPD then sent a bunch of informants to hookah bars. You had contractors come in and say, well, MSAs, they were created by the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1950s, Muslim Student Association, MSAs, by the Muslim Brotherhood, and the remnants of the Muslim Brotherhood still in these MSAs, and so we need to pay attention to the conversations. So then you had an MSA trip that went whitewater rafting, so you had an informant go whitewater rafting with the MSA. So that's why rhetoric correlates directly with policy, and when political leaders push back against that rhetoric, it does not allow for the extreme extremists to fill that vacuum. And when you have political leadership that steps in and says, you know what, we're not going to allow for this type of material, we'll create the material, we'll make sure that we vet the material, that's when you get change in the policy as well. So I think they're connected.
Okay, so your specific question was whether leadership needs to do more.
Should they be saying more, and is there a problem then in the community if the actions of at the lower level don't correspond with the leadership is saying?
I'm not 100% convinced that, I agree with what you're saying that rhetoric creates policy, but I actually think that there were problems at leadership in some instances. I think when Michael Mukasey ran the FBI, he said and did some things that were not clearly as welcoming as we've heard said here that America is or always has been. I do think there are problems in the community when rhetoric does not match up with actual policy. I think the problem gets to be that rhetoric and what President Bush said is all very lovely, but the truth of the matter is, and you know this, national security must take place in secrecy. Right? That's kind of how the nature of what it is. We're all safer because it takes place in secret, but then there's not a lot of public scrutiny of things that take place in secret. So I'd like to flip around your question a little bit, because when you talk about leadership, it sounds like we're all assuming, what can the government do to make things better? And I think I looked at this panel as talking about sort of what can we as either Muslims or allies do to make the situation better. And I think from my perspective, I really do think the problem is that most of the anti-Muslim bias comes from a place of, well, they deserve it. They've chosen this faith, they've chosen this lifestyle, they're engaging in these acts, so they deserve our scrutiny, they deserve everything we're sending this way. And it has not entered into the mindset of at least government officials yet that to some extent a lot of this bias is starting to become increasingly racialized and based upon immutable characteristics. I think that we who try to advocate for the community or who belong to the community ourselves, we perpetuate these stereotypes sometimes, possibly unconsciously. Especially when I hear things about, when organizations are trying to reach out and to cooperate with, say, the FBI. Now, CARE has had a history of reaching out and trying to help the FBI catch terrorists. Because, of course, post 9/11, they're no longer just law enforcement, they're also an intelligence agency. And if the perception is that Muslims are sort of inherently untrustworthy, how are you helping the reputation of Muslims when you go to a government agency who's surveilling your community and say, we want to help you by turning in our own? I mean, that doesn't create an impression of honesty. So there's perpetuation of that stereotype. Or the more we say we need to do more to prove how peace-loving Islam and Muslims, is or are, it perpetuates a stereotype that the bias is all caused by something of our own doing. So I don't think I quite answered your question.
Ah, good. Well, I wanted to open it up while we have time for questions. All right, we've got two friends. I don't think we have microphones, right? So I'll repeat the question. We start here, and then we'll go. What do you say?
I've got two things I want to say. One is part of the problem with this anti-Muslim feeling, it's leading to an erosion of the basic human rights that we have in this country, the laws. This is what David Cole talks about a lot. And if this is, so it becomes really a threat almost, I think, to the way American society has always been. Because all of this, where you've been stopping people at the airport, or you've had this, like the NSA has had invasions on all these telephone calls and everything, you could say maybe it started with the Muslims, but it's just part of an invasion of whole really society in general. And that's dangerous. And Bush, Obama is almost worse than Bush on this. The other thing is, I think one of the problems in the anti-Muslim feeling is that he's gone into the whole problem of international relations in this country. And for instance, I remember when it first started after 9/11, suddenly Sharon was talking about, everybody we're fighting here in Israel are terrorists. We're part of the anti-terrorist movement. But it's also come where you had, after that, you had people like Stephen Emerson and Lori Milrow, and they were coming up with these books and interviews and videos that they just weren't even true. And it was just kind of coming up with this propaganda to try to get the American public really thinking of Israel as Muslims as there's something the matter. And this kept up, and in Washington, I'm sure you were all there, after the Iraq War, even before 9/11, a lot of the organizations there were very jumpy about somebody coming even with a gun, like if you went to ADC or you went to any of these other groups, they were already jumpy at that point. So you've got, I think the invasion of our national and our inherent rights in this country is very important, but also you've got to look at it, what's also happening on the international scene too.
Okay. That's a great question, especially on the issue. The issue was concerns about the problem of anti-Muslim feelings, that this leading to a greater civil rights problem from the country, opening the door, you could say, to more increased invasions, and then also on the international relations. So.
Well, one of the things actually that I didn't get a chance to point out during the presentation was the degree to which that Muslims are viewed as immigrants by and large. So if you look at sort of views of immigrants and views of Muslims, they tend to be highly correlated. And I think that most Americans, or many Americans, have a sort of culturally a very close understanding of the immigrant story. That's a very profound and powerful thing. But I think most Americans don't understand the Muslim immigrant story. So why are Muslims coming to this country? I think that question of why are they here, what are their motives, is at the heart of a lot of the anti-Muslim sentiment that we're seeing, and it's about the immigrant story. So, Muslims are coming to the United States for the exact same reasons that many other immigrants, Catholics, Jews, others that came to the United States. But I think, we see that it's that sort of narrative is not clear for many Americans.
And, I'd like to address this issue because I think it's important that American Muslims also be a bit self-critical and introspective when we look at, the issue of narrative. We have not done a good job of telling our story. I mean, we just have not. People don't know who we are. We are we're a very diverse community, American community. We've got a large population of African American Muslims who've been in this country for centuries, who've contributed to the making of America. I mean, our organization, just as in commemoration of Black History Month, we just released a paper that we've been working on for the past 2 years now that looks at the contributions of Muslims to the making of America. And look at the number of Muslims who died in the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, and so that story is not told. The indigenous story is not told. Neither is the immigrant story told. And so if you if you look at this from a sociological perspective, if you don't have a story in America, good luck. Really, I mean, every American community has a story, and it goes beyond race. It goes beyond faith. I mean, the Irish, when they came to this country, I mean, you can't get more white than the Irish, but they had issues. And if you go to Massachusetts, you go to Boston, you talk with you see some of the old slums, Irish slums that were there, and that how the Kennedy family was formed, and so you have this but they were able to tell a story. They were able to tell a story of why they came to America and the potato famine and the fact that what they brought to America, what they contributed to America. The Italians, the same thing. And and so you've got multiple, whether they're immigrant or indigenous communities, have a story to tell in America, and that's also being told in the Hispanic American Latino narrative as well. Why? I mean, the Dreamers now, the Dreamers have become a story. Who are the Dreamers? The Dreamers are people who came to this country not fault of their own, but they are as American as anyone else. They're able to tell that story, and they're able to contribute to the economy and live the American dream. And so the president is talking about these dreamers, and Congress is talking about these dreamers, and that is a story that will be told. We as a community have not. And there are multiple reasons for that. Number one, I think, I'll give you a very personal anecdote. When I was finished high school, my family sat me down and said, you have career options. And those career options are medicine or engineering. And that's how it works generally. And if you really want to be a bit, risky, law. So that's how it generally was in a lot of Muslim households. And why is that? Because generally, especially the immigrant community, came from countries that were repressive, authoritarian. They came for economic upward mobility. They came for education, and they wanted to establish themselves and not go through the same struggles that they had to go through. That the parents had to go through, and so they wanted economic stability, they wanted social stability, and here comes 9/11, which destroys a lot of that. Because if you look at the Muslim institutions, majority of the funding from the Muslim community went to building mosques, Islamic schools, and sending relief and development money back home prior to 9/11. There was no investment in civic institutions. Very little, I won't say no, but very little investment in civic institutions, in political institutions, in PR institutions. That just didn't take place. After 9/11, when the community was thrust into this public conversation about their faith, about their story, about who they are, now you're seeing Muslim comedians and playwrights and artists and directors and actors, and they are now impacting the American Muslim story. And so it definitely is a generational issue, and it'll take some time, but we have to be a bit self-critical when we talk about the narrative, because the narrative in America is extremely important.
And Amar, when you asked this question, I really want to focus on
The domestic?
The domestic, the issue of the greater civil rights problem of if this is okay, if it's all right for us to have this investigative efforts against the Muslim community, what does that mean constitutionally for our constitutional rights in general?
Yeah. You know what's amazing about that, though, when you said that, you're right to be concerned, and there are people who are concerned. You know, the ACLU is very concerned, everyone's being spied on, but I think what's frightening is that the American public is not concerned, right? People are polled and say, that's okay, there's extra security at the airport, it takes me longer to fly, because at least I'm safer. People seem to be willing participants to sacrifice their own rights, because there's this idea of the greater good, and you know, as Americans, we do believe in self-sacrifice for the greater good. So it's sort of, so that I don't even know how to answer that, because I agree it's a problem, but I think most Americans don't agree that it's a problem. You also mentioned international relationships and sort of the idea that American Muslims, that perceptions of us are affected by what is taking place overseas, and there's an interrelationship. So I do want to comment a little bit on what I heard Dan and Hara saying in response to that, because I think what we often hear is that American Muslims really need to respond to what is happening with Muslims and Islam on the international stage, because that colors how we are perceived within the United States. And Horace mentioned this in his comments a while ago, and Dan also, that Muslims are perceived as immigrant, but our reality is that we're probably less immigrant than people think. I'm sure you've seen the movie Roots, and someone reminded me a little while ago that Kuta Kente was a Muslim originally. Really? I didn't watch that. Maybe I'll have to go back and see it again. But we do know that Islam came in on the slave ships. The Art Museum in Philadelphia has a picture of a very prominent early American Muslim from the 1700s displayed, a man named Deir Zero. But when we look at the demographics, the statistic you always hear is that American Muslims are 35% native-born, 65% foreign-born. And so that does make the community look like a mostly immigrant community. You definitely will see throughout the course of the day, with the exception of Mr. Cox over there, you'll see many first and second generation immigrants on these panels, because that's who's speaking for the community. But I was really struck a few months ago. I looked at a study actually done by my own organization, CARE, that went into that 65% that are foreign born, and learned that the overwhelming majority had been in this nation 20 years or more. I believe it was Dan who referenced the fact that the bulk of the immigration came in the 1960s. So now we're talking about 4 decades ago. You look at racial ethnic demographics, you know that American Muslims are approximately 1/3 African American, 1/3 from the Indian subcontinent, 1/3 everybody else. So Arabs are a small number than everybody else. But what does that mean in terms of our ability to advocate for ourselves and to understand law and policy in this country? Well, African Americans clearly understand English common law traditions, the American Civil Rights Movement. But interestingly enough, that immigration flux that happened in the 1960s came in sort of in the thick of the American Civil Rights Movement. And you also had a large proportion of American Muslims being South Asian have been governed by English common law as long as the United States has, right? So we're not as unsavvy as people think. I think the reason why historically our communities did not go into law and government was that we believed that, like other immigrant populations, say Eastern Europeans, Southern Europeans such as Italians, Jewish populations from various parts of Europe, and of course the Irish were an interesting group, but we would assimilate with the same rate as these other immigrant groups have. I think that's when you get back into the racial component. That a man named John Turanian out in California, I believe he's with Campbell, wrote a book called Whitewashed, talking about the fact that American Muslims assumed that if we downplayed advocacy, self-advocacy, we would eventually just be understood to be American the way that immigrant groups in the previous century had. And it didn't work out for us because we don't have the same privilege extended to other groups. So I hope I touched on those.
That's not quite what I'm saying. See, the problem is, first of all, what the first one is, when you have got maybe they're wiretapping your telephone, nobody knows it. You know, but it's there. You
I assume it's somebody else.
Yeah, but
You're not
it's
telling me.
there because it's going to be there. That's what you have to worry about. The problem, what I'm saying though about the Muslims, the average Muslim's coming over, he's working hard, and he's thinking about what's happening to him. But the whole issue of the Muslims has been gotten involved in perception in the American public, not because the Muslims wanted it themselves, but it became part of this whole problem with the Arabs, Palestinians, and everything else. And for instance, somebody said here, $50 million has been spent really on trashing Islam. Why? Why would anybody bother spending $50 million? It's part of the whole problem. And you have people, and you get it even today. You've got these great experts on terrorism. Are they really experts? Sit down, listen to them. I mean, they're a joke. The thing is, it's become not because the Muslims are interested in it, but they have been sucked into it because of issues beyond what's happening locally.
I agree with you that that's an important aspect of this. I'm concerned. I want to make sure I get to another person, but I think it is a very important perspective on this. Sir, you had a question.
Yeah, the question, you had asked about leadership, and I wanted to provide a little bit of context because I'm not sure I entirely agree with you about how much we know. Radical Islam it didn't start with 9/11. In fact, it started in Europe, as far back probably in Algeria. Some of those groups after Soviet oppression, and some of the folks not getting a voice. And then start to spread right in the 70s, really, with some of the leftist group essentially going and training in a lot of places in North Africa. And so there was a lot of action in Europe. And I think that if there's a mistake in terms of leadership, it's like a foresight, because things are happening, a lot of it. In fact, in Algeria, there were hundreds of thousands of people who were essentially murdered by extremists. But the problem is that in Europe, what we had nobody was trusting each other, and the big enemy was essentially USSR and the Eastern Bloc. So what you had is essentially the British intelligence not really trusting the French intelligence not really trusting the German intelligence, right? They're not sharing everything. Of course, what we knew is that some of the folks who were known terrorists had virtual immunity in Great Britain. So you could essentially go after those folks. And that sort of seeped through. And of course, now that 9/11 happened, we get all excited, because I think it seems that, at least in terms of our leadership, we tend to only think about the first degree impact, right? I mean, it's about, what's going to happen now. My concern is that when talking about leadership, I think that lack of foresight continues today. I think you mentioned about who gets to say who's Muslim, right? Because I've been prejudiced against, less in this country than a lot of other countries, but not one person has ever asked me whether I was a Muslim. But my skin color is suspect. Yeah. Right? So what does that mean in terms of the U.S.? Because if we tend to not take action, and action that maybe is something that would require more than what I think you mentioned President Bush had done early on, what is that going to do? Not first degree order, second, but I'm talking about really in the big picture of who we are as Americans, what's going to happen to the U.S. vis-a-vis sort of the rest of the world. Because if we lack to understand that, then I think we're going to, there's going to be something else going on that is going to be impacted by the decision we make today. So I don't know, short of suggesting leaders should all start to play chess and try to understand a little bit how to apply that to leadership. But I was wondering, does any of you have some idea on how to sort of expand or broaden the foresight of our leadership today?
What I would say is I would take issue with how you framed the conversation initially. You talked about geopolitical struggles, whether it's Algeria, North Africa, the Middle East, South Asia. These are extremely complex societies living under authoritarian and dictatorships for the past maybe 7 to 8 decades. And maybe you didn't, so I just want to clarify. You reduce that to radical Islam, and that's and you know when you look at international politics, it's not about radical Islam. If there are trends and strains of of individuals, whether they're in South Africa or South Asia or North Africa, who claim a certain what do you call it, a faith, or claim a certain basic ideology, but to curtail all of that and to lump it into radical Islam, that's where the initial problem of foresight lies. Because it's not radical Islam. It's complex issues. What happened in Algeria was specific to Algeria. It was not an international order. It was Algerian politics, European intervention, domestic authoritarianism. Yes, some extremism involved. There's no question that extremism was an aspect of it. But that was specific to Algeria. What's happening in Mali right now is specific to Mali. There's socioeconomic issues that are at play there. There's regional issues that are at play there. So I think that's for our leaders, number one. When you talk about foresight, the first foresight that they need to have is to understand the problem. And there was this film in 2006, when I go back, it was called Obsession, Radical Islam's War on the West. And so, it was 2006. There was about 25 million copies of this DVD made. It was done by, very shady organization that did not, disclose their finances, their background, the institution itself. So they made this film, and it basically did this. It took about 20 or 25 terrorist attacks that had happened around the world, and there were images of all these attacks on this map, and it basically said that all the attacks were connected somehow. And this was sent to all the swing states in 2006. In Virginia, I live in North Virginia, so all my neighbors got this. So for some reason, I didn't get it. My neighbors got it. I didn't get it.
I got it.
Oh, you got it? Okay.
I got it.
So you got it. So, our neighbor came to me like, I just got this film. It was mailed to me, and I don't know who mailed it to me. And imagine the money it cost to mail 25 million copies of this film in Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Florida, and all these swing states. And it essentially did that. It took an international geopolitical conflicts that are extremely nuanced, that have social, political, economic dynamics, ethnic, people who have been fighting for hundreds of years, of border issues, and it reduced it to the idea of radical Islam. And that's the worst thing that our leaders can do, is to take international conflicts, regional conflicts, and reduce it to one ideology. That's what's going to impact us negatively. And unfortunately, that was the issue with the whole terminology on war on terror. You had, you can't have war on terror and then you have a declared international war on terror. So I'm hopeful that I think our government has learned from that to a certain extent. That especially our military leaders. I give our military leaders more credit than our civilian leaders on a lot of these issues. Because our military leaders, when they go in, they want to get the operation done. They politicize the issue much less than our civilian leaders do. And and I see a lot of more nuance coming from our military leaders on this issue. I just finished reading General McChrystal's book, and it was very heartening to understand how much nuance he kind of exhibited in his understanding of these conflicts. So that's what I would warn against. From the foresight has to be that this is not an international conspiracy, Islamist or radical Islamist conspiracy. That's the worst thing that we can do to the conflict.
Let me get a Mariam before we run out.
Actually, I think Horace said it'd be a flip.
Okay. Monica, how much time do we have? One more question? Ma'am?
I'm a journalist, not a lawyer, and I have one very basic question. In your timeline, you started everything with the oil embargo. To what extent was the creation of the State of Israel an effect, a major, or to what extent did that have on our situation today?
Mara, do you want to start with that?
You know what? I would rather look at you, Joe, and take this.
Okay.
I don't mean to deflect it. Honestly, I think you raise a valid point. I do think it affects the issue. I will just say that my background is on domestic civil rights and domestic criminal law, and so I just cannot speak to it. So
I will also defer.
Of course,
my fiance probably wants to answer you, but he'll talk after the break.
I'll get in trouble. It's okay. No, I mean, I think the creation of the state of Israel again is a geopolitical issue.
Why didn't you mention it?
Well, I didn't mention specific because I mentioned Algeria because Algeria was mentioned in the context. I'm not sure that I wanted to go back that far. I'm not. I don't think that. I'm not one of those who believe that the state of Israel is the cause of all problems in that region and in the world. I mean, I just don't believe that. I think it's a geopolitical issue. It's the Israelis, the Palestinians, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, and they're going to have to deal with that issue. And they've been dealing. At times they've dealt with it positively, at times negatively. At times, yes, the issue of Israel has at times been politicized here in the U.S. But I would not